My name is Carrie, and at 62 years old, I thought I knew what pride felt like. I had just stepped off the plane at Denver International Airport, my heart racing with excitement to see my daughter Emma after 2 long years. She had moved to Colorado to work at some fancy law firm, and I had been counting down the days until this visit. The last time we talked, she mentioned wanting me to meet her new neighbors at a housewarming party. I was so thrilled that my successful daughter wanted to show me off to her new life. Little did I know that this trip would teach me something I never expected about family shame and secrets that run deeper than I ever imagined. Before we dive into this story, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Please hit that like button if you have ever felt proud of someone you love, and do not forget to subscribe, because today's story is about discovering that sometimes the people we think we know best are hiding the biggest surprises. Trust me, you will want to stick around to find out what my daughter never realized I already owned. Growing up, Emma and I were inseparable. After her father, Frank, passed away 5 years ago in that horrible car accident, we became even closer. Frank had been the love of my life, and losing him left a hole in our small family that Emma and I had to fill together. She was our only child, our pride and joy, and watching her graduate law school and land that position at Morrison and Associates in Denver had been the highlight of my recent years. I had been living alone in our modest little house in Quincy, Massachusetts, working as a bookkeeper for small local businesses. It was not glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. My neighbors knew me as the hard-working widow who drove a well-maintained 2015 Honda Accord and shopped sensibly at Target and the local grocery stores. I dressed simply, lived quietly, and found contentment in my routine. For 6 months, I had been putting aside money from my bookkeeping clients, saving every penny I could for this airplane ticket. Emma had called me so excitedly about her new house and how she wanted me to come see it. She had been working such long hours at the law firm, and I was so proud of how she was building her career. When she mentioned the housewarming party and how she wanted to introduce me to her new neighborhood friends, my heart just soared. I had carefully packed my suitcase with my best clothes, which admittedly were not much to look at. My nicest dress was a navy blue one I had bought at Walmart 3 years ago, and my good shoes were sensible black flats from Payless before they closed down. But I had also packed something special. I had spent hours making Emma's favorite apple pie from scratch, the same recipe her grandmother had taught me. I had also brought along a photo album filled with pictures of Emma growing up, thinking her new friends might enjoy seeing what a beautiful child she had been. During our phone calls leading up to the trip, I had started noticing something different in Emma's voice. She seemed more formal, somehow, more distant. When I asked about her new life, she would talk about her colleagues and her neighborhood using words like prestigious and exclusive. She had mentioned several times how important these new connections were for her career advancement. I had brushed off my concerns, thinking she was just excited about her professional growth. The week before my flight, Emma had called and spent most of the conversation talking about how fancy her neighborhood was and how successful all her neighbors were. She had used phrases like very upscale community and influential people. I had started to feel a little nervous about fitting in, but I figured that as long as Emma was happy and proud of me, everything would be fine. When I emerged from the baggage claim area at Denver International Airport, I spotted Emma immediately. She was standing near the pickup area, and my first thought was how stunning she looked. She was wearing what appeared to be an expensive black business suit that I had never seen before, carrying a leather handbag that looked like it cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. On her wrist was a watch that caught the light beautifully, and her entire appearance screamed success and sophistication. But something felt off about our reunion. Instead of the warm hug and excited chatter I was expecting, Emma gave me a quick, almost formal embrace and immediately started talking about traffic and timing. As we walked toward the parking garage, she kept glancing around nervously, as if she was worried about being seen. When we reached her car, I nearly gasped. It was a brand new BMW X5 gleaming silver and obviously expensive. This was definitely not the modest Honda she had been driving in Boston. During the drive to her house, Emma filled the silence by talking almost nonstop about her work stress and her important clients. She mentioned several times how demanding her colleagues were and how much pressure she was under to maintain certain appearances. She pointed out various landmarks and neighborhoods, always emphasizing how exclusive or expensive they were. The neighborhoods we drove through were indeed beautiful, with sprawling houses and perfectly manicured lawns that looked like something from a magazine. When we entered Highlands Ranch, Emma's voice took on a different tone entirely. She began describing her neighbors in detail. There was Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a plastic surgeon who lived 2 houses down, and James Wellington, who was apparently some kind of technology executive. She mentioned Sandra Martinez, an investment banker, and several other professional people whose names and job titles she recited like she had memorized them. With each description, I felt myself becoming smaller and more inadequate. Emma's house took my breath away, but not in the good way I had been expecting. It was a massive 2-story brick home with perfectly landscaped gardens, a 3-car garage, and what appeared to be a swimming pool in the backyard. The house had to be at least 4,000 square feet, maybe more. As we pulled into the circular driveway, I could not help but wonder how a 28-year-old lawyer, even a successful one, could afford such an elaborate home. Inside the house was even more impressive and intimidating. Every piece of furniture looked like it had come from an expensive showroom, and the artwork on the walls was clearly not something you would find at a discount store. Emma gave me a tour, pointing out features like the granite countertops, the hardwood floors, and the master suite with its enormous bathroom. I kept nodding and making appropriate comments, but inside I was feeling more and more out of place. That evening, as Emma showed me to the guest room, she casually asked what I was planning to wear to the party the next day. When I described my navy dress and black shoes, I watched her face carefully control its expression. After a moment of silence, she suggested that we go shopping the next morning so I could find something more suitable for the occasion. The way she said it made it clear that my clothes were not going to be acceptable for meeting her new friends. The next morning, Emma drove me to Nordstrom, a store I had never set foot in before. As we walked through the gleaming aisles filled with clothes that cost more than I typically spent in several months, Emma began what felt like a coaching session. She explained that her neighborhood friends were very particular about appearances and first impressions. She described the kind of conversations I might expect and suggested topics I should and should not bring up. As Emma selected a dress for me to try on, she casually mentioned that it might be better if I described myself as a retired teacher rather than a bookkeeper. She explained that education was more respected in her circle, and since I had helped so many clients with their financial paperwork over the years, it was not really lying. The dress she chose was beautiful, a sophisticated charcoal gray that fit perfectly, but the $300 price tag made me feel dizzy. While Emma added matching shoes, a handbag, and accessories to our growing pile of purchases, she continued her gentle instruction session. She suggested that instead of mentioning our modest home in Quincy, I should say I lived in Newton, which apparently had a better reputation. She recommended that I avoid discussing my bookkeeping clients, since they were mostly small local businesses that would not impress anyone. With each suggestion, I felt like she was asking me to erase a little bit more of who I actually was. When we reached the cosmetics counter, Emma arranged for a complete makeover. As the makeup artist worked on my face, Emma sat nearby, making phone calls about party preparations. I overheard her talking to someone about catering and decorations, mentioning expenses that seemed astronomical to me. She also made several references to wanting everything to be perfect because the impression she made on her neighbors was crucial for her career advancement. During the makeover process, Emma stepped away to take a private phone call. While she was gone, the friendly makeup artist asked me about my daughter and how proud I must be of her success. I started to share some stories about Emma's childhood and her hard work in law school, but when Emma returned, she quickly changed the subject. She complimented my new look and hurried us toward the checkout counter. As we loaded our shopping bags into the BMW, Emma seemed more relaxed than she had since I arrived. She chatted about the party logistics and mentioned how excited she was for me to meet everyone. But then she made a comment that sent a chill through me. She said she had been telling people that her family back east was very successful, and she hoped I would remember that during conversations. The way she said it made it clear that this was not a suggestion. On the drive home, Emma's nervousness returned. She began what she called a practice session, asking me questions that her neighbors might ask and coaching me on the best answers. When would I retire from teaching? I should say I had just retired last year. Where did I live? Newton, in a lovely neighborhood near the historical district. What had my husband done for work? He had been in insurance, very successful, tragically taken too young. Each answer felt like another layer of deception covering up our real life. The morning of the party, Emma was clearly having some kind of nervous breakdown. She walked through the house multiple times, adjusting decorations and checking every detail. The catering staff had arrived early to set up an elaborate spread of food and drinks that looked like something from a magazine photo shoot. Emma had changed clothes 3 times and was constantly checking her reflection in mirrors throughout the house. Around 10 o'clock, Emma sat me down at her kitchen island for what she called our final review session. She went through our agreed-upon story one more time, but now she was adding even more details. I was not just a retired teacher. I was a retired English teacher who had taught at a private school. My husband Frank was not just in insurance. He had owned his own successful agency. We had not just lived in Newton, we had lived in a historic home in the most desirable part of town. Each lie felt like a small betrayal of Frank's memory and our real life together. Frank had indeed worked in insurance, but he had started as a claims adjuster and worked his way up through sheer determination and integrity. Our home in Quincy was modest, but filled with love and laughter. My work as a bookkeeper had been honest and valuable, helping small business owners manage their finances and achieve their dreams. Why was our real life not good enough for Emma's new friends? Around noon, just as I was putting on my new dress and getting ready for the guests to arrive, Emma came into my room looking more anxious than I had ever seen her. She sat on the edge of the bed and took my hands in hers, and what she said next nearly knocked me over. She asked me very quietly if I could introduce myself to the neighbors as a family friend rather than her mother. She said it would be easier for everyone and would help avoid complicated questions about our family background. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what my daughter had just asked me to do. She explained that she had already told some of her neighbors that her mother lived in Europe and traveled frequently. She said she had mentioned that her parents had both been very successful professionals who had passed away, leaving her comfortable financially. She begged me to understand that she had worked so hard to build her reputation in this community and that having to explain our real situation would undermine everything she had accomplished. The most devastating part was when she asked me not to call her by any of the pet names I had used her entire life. No more honey, no more sweetheart, No more baby girl. Just Emma spoken with the same formal distance I might use with a stranger. She also specifically asked me not to mention Frank's car accident or anything about my current financial situation. In essence, she was asking me to pretend that our entire life together had never happened. As I heard the first cars pulling up in the driveway, Emma squeezed my hands and whispered that she knew this was hard, but that it was just for one afternoon. She promised that after the party we could go back to normal and enjoy the rest of my visit. But as I looked into her eyes, I could see that she truly believed what she was asking was reasonable. She had convinced herself that our real life was something to be ashamed of, and that these new neighbors and their opinions were more important than the mother who had raised her. The first guests to arrive were Dr. Patricia Hoffman and her husband Richard, who turned out to be a cardiologist. They were an elegant couple in their 50s, dressed in the kind of casual, expensive clothing that only looks simple until you see the price tags. Emma introduced me exactly as she had requested. "This is Carrie, a dear family friend visiting from back east." The words felt like poison in my mouth as I smiled and shook their hands. Dr. Hoffman immediately began asking me questions about my background and my connection to Emma. Following our rehearsed script, I explained that I was a recently retired English teacher who had known Emma's family for many years. When she asked about my travel from Massachusetts, I mentioned Newton and watched Emma's satisfied smile as I delivered the lie perfectly. Dr. Hoffman seemed impressed and mentioned that she had attended medical school near Boston and knew the area well. James Wellington arrived next with his wife Caroline, and Emma introduced them as technology executives who had founded several successful startups. James was immediately curious about my educational background and began discussing various private schools in the Newton area. I found myself having to improvise answers about schools I had never worked at and educational philosophies I knew nothing about. Emma hovered nearby, ready to redirect conversations whenever I seemed to be struggling. As more neighbors arrived, I had to repeat our fictional story over and over again. Each time I described my imaginary career as a private school English teacher, I felt like I was betraying every small business owner I had ever helped with their bookkeeping. Each time I mentioned our supposed home in Newton, I was dishonoring the modest but loving house in Quincy where Frank and I had built our life together. Sandra Martinez, the investment banker, was particularly interested in real estate values and began discussing property markets in various Boston suburbs. She mentioned that Emma had told her she had received substantial help from family money when purchasing her house. I watched in amazement as Emma nodded along with this story, knowing full well that she had financed her house through student loans and her law firm's salary, working overtime almost every weekend to make the payments. The most painful moment came when Dr. Hoffman began asking Emma about her family background while I was standing right there. Emma launched into an elaborate story about her mother being a Harvard Business School graduate who traveled extensively for consulting work. She described her father as a successful hedge fund manager who had passed away while Emma was in college, leaving behind a substantial estate. She spoke about growing up in private schools in Cambridge and spending summers at a family home on the Cape. Every word was a complete fabrication, and every word felt like a knife in my heart. The real story was that Frank and I had worked multiple jobs to pay for Emma's education. I had taken on extra bookkeeping clients, and Frank had worked overtime at the insurance company for years to make sure Emma could attend a good college without going into debt. We had saved every penny we could shopping at discount stores and driving our cars until they fell apart, all so that Emma could have opportunities we had never had. When Caroline Wellington complimented Emma on her sophisticated upbringing, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I felt like I was going to be sick. Standing in Emma's beautiful guest bathroom, looking at my reflection in the expensive new outfit she had bought me, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. My daughter was not just ashamed of our financial situation, she was ashamed of everything we were and everything we had done for her. After I composed myself in the bathroom, I returned to the party with a new sense of determination. I had spent the first hour of the gathering feeling hurt and confused, but now I was beginning to feel something else entirely. I was starting to get angry, and more importantly, I was starting to remember some things about our family that Emma had apparently forgotten or never known. I listened as James Wellington praised Emma for her smart real estate investment, and I heard Emma agree that she had been fortunate to have family financial support for her house purchase. I knew for a fact that Emma had struggled to qualify for her mortgage and had been working 60-hour weeks to make the payments. The idea that she had family money was ridiculous, or at least that's what I had thought until this moment. When Sandra Martinez began discussing investment strategies and asking Emma about her family's portfolio management, I watched my daughter navigate the conversation with surprising sophistication. She spoke knowledgeably about trust funds and inheritance planning topics that I had never heard her discuss before. Either she had learned a great deal about finance very quickly, or she knew more about our family's financial situation than I had realized. Dr. Hoffman mentioned that Emma had told her about growing up with parents who were very focused on financial planning and generational wealth building. According to Emma's story, her parents had been very conservative investors who had built their wealth slowly and carefully over many years. This was closer to the truth than her other lies, but it still felt like a distortion of our actual experience. As I continued to listen to these conversations, I began to remember some things that Frank and I had discussed privately over the years. There had been conversations about investments and planning that we had kept to ourselves. There had been decisions we had made about Emma's future that we had never shared with her. Frank had always been more financially sophisticated than I had given him credit for, and there were aspects of his work in insurance that I had never fully understood. The turning point came when Caroline Wellington asked me directly about my travel plans and whether I was planning to visit any other family during my time in Colorado. Before I could answer, Emma quickly jumped in to explain that I was quite the world traveler and was actually considering a trip to Europe next month. As she spoke, I realized that she was not just ashamed of who I was, she was living in complete denial about our family's reality. That was when I decided that this charade had gone on long enough. I had spent 62 years being honest and straightforward, and I was not about to spend another minute pretending to be someone else to impress a group of strangers. More importantly, I realized that Emma needed to learn some truths about our family that Frank and I had been saving for the right time. Clearly, that time had arrived. I politely excused myself from the conversation and went to find my purse, where I had my phone and some documents that I always carried with me. It was time for Emma to understand that there were things about her family that she had never known, and that her assumptions about our financial situation were not entirely accurate. The inheritance that Frank and I had planned to give her when she turned 30 was substantial, but after today's performance, I was beginning to question whether she was ready for that responsibility. After the last guest left, and Emma had finished cleaning up with the catering staff, I asked her to sit down with me in her living room. She looked exhausted and relieved that the party was over, but she also seemed pleased with how everything had gone. She thanked me for playing along with the story and said she thought everyone had been impressed. That was when I told her we needed to have a serious conversation about what had happened that afternoon. Emma immediately became defensive, explaining that I did not understand the pressure she was under in her career. She said that in her profession, appearances and connections were everything, and that having the right background could make or break her advancement opportunities. She talked about how hard she had worked to build her reputation and how important it was to fit in with her colleagues and neighbors. She told me that she had not meant to hurt my feelings, but that she just needed one evening where she did not have to explain why her mother was just a bookkeeper and why her father had died in a car accident instead of living a long, successful life. She said she was tired of being pitied for her modest background and wanted to experience what it felt like to be seen as someone who came from privilege and success. I listened to everything she had to say, and then I calmly told her that there were things about our family that she did not know. I explained that her father and I had made certain decisions about how much to tell her about our finances because we wanted her to develop her own work ethic and character. I said that we had been planning to share some information with her when she turned 30, but that after today's events, I thought she needed to know sooner. I pulled out my phone and showed Emma my banking app, which displayed account balances that made her eyes widen in shock. The numbers on the screen showed several $1,000,000 across various accounts and investments. When she asked me what this meant, I explained that her father had not just been any insurance agent. He had been the founder and owner of Quincy Mutual Insurance Company, which he had built from nothing over 25 years. Frank had sold the company 2 years before his death for $8.7 million after taxes. We had invested the money carefully and had continued living our modest lifestyle because we wanted Emma to understand the value of hard work and genuine accomplishment. The plan had been to give her the inheritance when she turned 30, along with an explanation of how her father had built his wealth through integrity, hard work, and treating people fairly. I explained that I had continued working as a bookkeeper not because we needed the money, but because I enjoyed the work and wanted to stay productive. Our modest house in Quincy was a choice, not a limitation. We could have afforded to live anywhere, but we were happy with our life and our community. The old Honda I drove was perfectly reliable, and we saw no reason to spend money on expensive cars just to impress other people. Emma sat in stunned silence as I continued explaining our family's real financial situation. I told her about the 3 properties I owned in the Boston area through various trusts and investment vehicles. One of those properties was actually the building that housed the law firm where she had worked before moving to Denver. I had been her landlord's landlord without her ever knowing it. The look on Emma's face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and what I hoped was the beginning of understanding. She asked me why we had never told her any of this, and I explained that we wanted her to know she could succeed on her own merits. We wanted her to be proud of her achievements, not dependent on family money. But after listening to her lies about our family that afternoon, I was beginning to wonder if we had made a mistake in keeping these secrets. I looked at my daughter sitting in her beautiful living room, surrounded by all the expensive things she had worked so hard to buy, and I made a decision that Frank and I had never planned for. I told Emma that she was going to have a choice to make, and that her decision would determine not just her inheritance, but the kind of person she was going to be for the rest of her life. I explained that she could have the inheritance, all $8.7 million of it, but she would have to earn it by proving she was still the daughter Frank and I had raised. That meant being honest about her family, being proud of where she came from, and understanding that real success comes from character, not from impressing people with lies. Or she could continue pretending that Frank and I had never existed, and she could inherit nothing. Emma broke down completely at that point, crying harder than I had seen her cry since she was a little girl. She told me how sorry she was and how ashamed she felt about what she had done. She said she had been so scared of not fitting in and so worried about her career that she had lost sight of what was really important. She talked about how hard she had worked to get where she was and how terrified she was of anything that might jeopardize her position. I held my daughter while she cried, and I told her that I understood her fear, but that she had to understand mine as well. I was afraid that in trying to give her everything, Frank and I had somehow failed to give her the most important thing, which was pride in who she really was. I was afraid that she valued other people's opinions more than her own family, and that she had forgotten the difference between earning respect and buying it. When Emma finally stopped crying, I suggested that she host another gathering with her neighbors, but this time she would introduce me properly as her mother. She would share real stories about our family, about Frank's journey from claims adjuster to successful business owner, about my work helping small businesses manage their finances, and about the values that had guided our family through both struggles and success. I told her that if her friends and colleagues could not accept her real family, then they were not the kind of people worth impressing anyway. Real relationships, whether personal or professional, had to be built on truth and authenticity. People who only valued her based on fictional stories about her background were never going to be true friends or reliable professional contacts. Emma agreed immediately, saying she wanted to make things right and that she was ready to tell the truth about our family. She called several of her neighbors that evening and invited them for a casual barbecue the following weekend. She said she had some things she wanted to share with them and that she hoped they would join us for a more relaxed gathering. Over the next few days, Emma and I spent hours talking about our family history and her father's legacy. I shared stories about Frank's early struggles in the insurance business and how he had slowly built his company by treating every customer fairly and standing behind every policy he sold. Emma began to understand that her father's success had come not from privilege or luck, but from the same work ethic and integrity that she had developed in her own career. When the day of the barbecue arrived, Emma introduced me with genuine pride as her mother, the woman who had supported her family through every challenge and celebration. She told our guests about Frank's journey from working-class roots to business success and about how our family had always valued character over appearances. She shared stories about our life in Quincy and the lessons she had learned from growing up in a family that measured success by how we treated other people. The response from her neighbors was overwhelmingly positive. Dr. Hoffman talked about her own modest background and how she had worked her way through medical school. James Wellington shared stories about his early failures as an entrepreneur and the importance of persistence and integrity in business. Sandra Martinez talked about growing up in a working-class family and how those experiences had shaped her approach to financial planning. Everyone respected Emma's honesty, and several of her neighbors mentioned that they found her real story much more impressive than the fictional background she had originally shared. They appreciated her authenticity and her willingness to be vulnerable about her family's journey. The relationships she built that day were stronger and more genuine than anything that could have been constructed on lies and pretense. By the time I returned to Massachusetts the following week, Emma and I had planned regular visits that would not require any pretense or performance. She had booked a trip to come see me in Quincy, where I would show her the neighborhood where she had grown up and introduce her to the community that had supported our family through good times and bad. Emma also made changes in how she talked about her background with her colleagues and professional contacts. She began sharing appropriate details about her real family history, and she found that people were more impressed by her authentic journey than they had ever been by her fictional stories. She started volunteering with a local organization that helped first-generation college students navigate their careers, using her own experience to mentor young people who were struggling with similar questions about identity and belonging. Most importantly, Emma began to understand that the inheritance Frank and I had planned for her was not just about money. It was about the responsibility that comes with financial security and the obligation to use resources wisely and generously. She realized that her father's legacy was not just the wealth he had accumulated, but the principles he had followed in building that wealth. The money I showed her that day was real, and when she turns 30 next year, it will become hers as Frank and I had always planned. But now she will receive it with a full understanding of where it came from and what it represents. She will know that her father built his success through honesty, hard work, and treating every person with dignity and respect. She will understand that wealth is a tool for creating opportunities, not a way to distance yourself from your roots. I learned something important during that trip to Denver as well. I learned that hiding who you are does not make you belong anywhere. It just makes you a stranger to everyone, including yourself. Real success is not about impressing people with lies about your background. It is about being proud of your truth and building relationships based on authenticity and mutual respect. Sometimes the people we are most ashamed of are the ones who made us who we are. And sometimes the life we think is not good enough is exactly what someone else is praying for. I flew across the country thinking I was visiting my successful daughter, but I discovered that she needed to remember the daughter Frank and I had raised. Money does not change who you are, but it reveals who you have always been. Emma had to choose between the inheritance I could give her and the character she had already earned. In the end, she chose both because she finally understood they were never separate. That is when I knew that Frank and I had raised her right after all. Have you ever felt ashamed of your background or your family's journey? Have you ever been tempted to create a different story about where you came from? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because I think many of us have struggled with questions about identity and belonging at some point in our lives. Please like this video if Emma's story reminded you of the importance of staying true to your roots, and subscribe to hear more stories about family forgiveness and finding your way back to what matters most. Share this with someone who might need to remember that their real story is worth celebrating. Thank you for listening to my story today, and remember that the people who love you for who you really are will always be more valuable than those who only love the person you pretend to be.